Sabrina 90s comic issue 19. Based on the title, and what little I let myself see of the cover, I can already tell what the premise is going to be. Sabrina goes to the guidance counselor at school who wanted to see her, and it turns out he was playing the guitar to relax, and she surprised him by walking in early. She compliments the music, and he says that when he was younger he wanted to be a folk singer, but his family insisted he pursue a career in education. Out of nowhere, she asks him if he was a hippie. I guess because she saw the picture on the wall, when she didn't get drawn looking at it. He says he qualified, and he wants to go over her career aspirations instead of missing out on a dream like he did, which makes her feel sorry for him. Well, it's possible that some job that a person wanted to have would actually be too difficult and hard to get and pointless. So it could be justified not bothering. She tells Salem at home that they don't have time for her to get him food. Then she uses magic to zap a peace symbol on his collar. She asks him if Hilda and Zelda are still at the witch doctor for their annual appointment because she wants to take a trip back to the 60s. And for some reason, Salem goes into denial about what she means at first. It's so him that he cares more about getting food than this. Sabrina finally lampshades things, saying that she doesn't do enough good deeds with her magic. Salem wants her to help an old lady cross the street or something. Her idea is obvious, and Salem warns him that there's a rule against witches changing history. So the rule is back? Sabrina asks who will know. If the writer really cared about enforcing that rule, a spy witch would immediately use magic to brainwash her into changing her mind, and we'd see him say all no. But since there's no mortals around, it kinda makes sense that she's not being supervised. So then the rule is kind of unenforceable. Then she misunderstands time travel, saying that she'll do it and get them back by dinner. No, she'd get them back at the same time she just left. She'd have to go to dinner time on purpose. She warps herself to the 60s, and I wonder if the story's gonna cram as many 60s stereotypes as it can into it while being kid-friendly, sugarcoating the era entirely. Speaking of that, it sure is nice that that civilian is smiling. Sabrina's offended when a guy calls her man as slang. Well, I'd be annoyed at it too, but I know not to say this. He tells this random girl he just met that there's a big demonstration for peace in front of City Hall. She figures that this is where she might find her guidance counselor. Meanwhile, Hilda and Zelda are relatively glad their appointment is over, and they realize that Sabrina and Salem aren't home. It's all Sabrina's fault for planning on time traveling back home hours ahead when dinner will be ready instead of returning to just a second after she left. And then time traveling ahead to when dinner will be ready. I guess there was a time skip, where the ants searched the entire house, because otherwise, it'd make no sense if they immediately knew no one was home a panel later. That seems unfair to Sabrina. It sure is convenient for Zelda that Sabrina left the magic book open, on the time travel section, and a page didn't fall closed from gravity. Hilda uses magic on the mirror, using a rewind spell that shows her what Sabrina did. Zelda gets paranoid, even though it's just gonna be one meaningless person whose life Sabrina's gonna change. And so what if he becomes a folk singer? And what if she fails to convince him? Surely she wouldn't have been the only one telling him he should follow his dream. He was with hippies. Because bullshit, rather than Zelda and Hilda simply teleporting Sabrina and Salem to them immediately, Hilda decides to go back in time to search through a needle in a haystack in the hopes that they'd eventually find them in the city. Did she just want to go revisit the 60s, for no reason? She could do that on her own time. She could stop Sabrina in a second if she really wanted to. Zelda's hair has changed to look different because green hair would stick out in the 60s. And then out of nowhere, it turns out that in the late 60s, the sunspots were so extreme that all of the witch's powers were greatly reduced for 2 years. Bullshit. Hilda then says it's a conspiracy theory that mortal space travel to the moon was to blame. How would that cause sunspots? I don't understand. The sun is really far away from the Earth. If the witches were getting their magic from tapping into the natural magic around the sun, and thus sunspots blocked the magic from getting out, they'd have to be able to tap into it from really far away. That's why I always assumed that the Mobians got their powers from magic on Mobius, not another planet entirely, or a star. It just doesn't make as much sense. But they already have magic, so I guess any scientific logic's out the window. Still, it's frustrating that this doesn't make any sense at all. If the witches had all stumbled into another witch who enchanted their magic away temporarily in the 60s just to be a jerk, it makes sense. Maybe it could be someone who knew the Spellman in high school. Also, how did they expect to go back to their own time if they'd have basically no magic once they time traveled to the 60s? Then we see a comedy page as a welcome break from that unnecessary nonsense. Zelda asks Sabrina where Hilda is because she needs to ask her something, as Sabrina's reading a book on the armchair instead of in her quiet bedroom where she wouldn't be disturbed for some reason. I guess the reason that Zelda doesn't simply teleport her sister to her is that for all she knows, she's in the bathroom. And she doesn't want to interrupt her doing something, no matter what it is. It'd probably be basic witch courtesy as a result to not do this. But it's still an emergency, so that doesn't explain why they didn't warp Sabrina back to them when she time traveled. Sabrina says that Hilda's behind her in the backyard, saying she's out back. Then because bullshit, Zelda thought Sabrina meant outback, and went through half of Australia and brought back a kangaroo, when clearly Zelda would have seen Hilda right behind Sabrina. It would have made sense if the curtains were closed. I guess this was before cell phones. Back in the past, Sabrina gladly takes a sign thanking the hippie and says that this is cool. She recognizes her guidance counselor from the picture, and he says that Mr. Lansing is his father and his nickname is Sunshine. And he doesn't know how Sabrina found out his real name, but he doesn't like his real name, and that's why he uses a nickname. For some reason, he doesn't ask how she knows him already, because if he did, he'd freak out at the answer. So it's very convenient that he doesn't ask that. Because this is before the internet, and he's never seen her before, so she's not a fellow high school student. She should say that she's a fellow high school student of his. Fortunately for Sabrina, he has a guitar with him at a protest, which is a natural conversation starter for her. For some reason, Sabrina asks him to play her a tune instead of immediately getting to the point and encouraging him to never give up on his dream. She was probably just trying to enjoy herself in the moment and got distracted easily because she's a social person. But still, that's dumb of her. Then the police blows a whistle and says that the mayor wants all of the protesters out of here right away, calling them deadbeats. Because they refuse to leave, the cop plans to arrest them. One of them is stupid enough to think that'll be cool, even though having a criminal record would hurt his job prospects. Sabrina can't zap herself away, and Salem somehow wasn't heard by the people right near him. The cop doesn't get what she means when she says that her powers aren't working, and she tells Salem to get help. He could at least have a thought bubble saying, "That girl's crazy." A cop tells another one to grab the cat too, because he belongs to one of them, which is justified because it's better to keep them together than have him be a stray. So that was more responsible. Meanwhile, Zelda doesn't know where to look. Things would be so much easier for them if they could use a spell to not only time travel back in time, but also make sure they warp directly to someone whose DNA they have a sample of. Combine that with scrying. Hilda wants to go clothes shopping for a couple of minutes, and Zelda likes the dress. Coincidentally, Salem runs into that exact same place and hides in the dressing room. That was very convenient. They could have been miles away from each other. It's not like Hilda and Zelda warped to the late 60s Riverdale peace protests just like Sabrina did. They seemed to have no logic in where they send themselves beyond going to Riverdale in particular. Salem runs into Zelda's dressing room, and fortunately it wasn't at a really bad moment. Instead, she was wearing an entire underdress. I guess because she's old, so she's old-fashioned. You'd think she'd feel a bit more hot having to wear that entire thing under clothes every day. She calls out Salem's name, and it makes sense that Salem asks if that's Zelda because she probably didn't change her voice and she knows his name. A guy asks her if she's okay in there, which is considerate, and realistically, one of the other women nearby looked out too. She lies that she just pinched herself with a zipper, which doesn't explain why she said Salem. She's lucky people are too polite here to ask her that. Salem thanks Zelda for showing up to save him and stays in her bag as he explains himself. Sabrina really should have known the protest would end in an arrest, because what protest doesn't? But at least she had an excuse to go because she had to go there to accomplish her goal. I'm glad Zelda's whatever response proves that it isn't the mortal space travel's fault that their powers are useless. Fortunately, logic kicks in a little, as they will have hope of getting home if all three witches combine their powers. I wouldn't have been confused if I had been told this a lot earlier. See, maybe this could have made sense if the Witches' Council due to some brand new wide-eyed leadership, had intentionally done this to witches in the late 60s to try to control witches better, so that there would be less selfish magic abuse, because witches would have to combine their powers to use them at all. Of course, witches could just convince other witches to help them. Maybe they get their family involved. So that's probably why this was considered a catastrophic failure. Maybe it just made witches form gangs and live with them so they could use their powers just as they did before. Or ask their family for help, so there's no point. Maybe these guys only believe the Sunspot's explanation because the Witches' Council brainwashed them into it. See, the Sabrina series can have dark things about it without going too far. In fact, this is trying to be a tense plot, with only a little predictable comedy. But the comedy is still there. Out of complete nowhere, when they go to the jail, they're called hippie chicks for no reason, and Hilda thinks that the word hippie was used to call them fat. And Zelda somehow knows that that's why Hilda was offended, and has to tell her how he's spelling hippie. So Hilda says in relief that she thought her outfit was slimming. The only reason they're mistaken for hippies is that Hilda has a peace sign necklace just to blend in. But that wouldn't blend them in. That'd make them stand out as part of a very specific counterculture group. Anyways, they're here to pick up their niece. The douchebag says that they're keeping the entire demonstration overnight, including a teenage girl, to teach them a lesson. Even though clearly is hopeless. He's told that she never did this before, and he tells her to tell it to the judge tomorrow, making me wish they did have their powers so that she could teach him a lesson. Because life's unfair, so it's nice to see the characters have magic so that they can even the odds. Then there's a comedy page again. Not that I mind these because they're new stories. Hilda tells Harvey to have Sabrina home by midnight, and Sabrina says that everyone might want to hang out after the movie. Harvey says that it's not like Sabrina's going to turn into a pumpkin if she stays out later. Sabrina gets scared, and then looks at Hilda and says, "You wouldn't dare!" And Hilda says, "Try me." I'm relieved that the final panel wasn't showing her as a pumpkin. That not only revealed magic to mortals, but also be mean to Sabrina. She's showing authority over her as a parental figure, but it's not in a mean way. She's not being overly strict, she's doing what any parent has to do. Can Sabrina use magic to get rid of her tiredness, so it doesn't really matter if she stays up late? Meanwhile, Sabrina's asked by a friendly girl if this is her first time in the slammer, and Sabrina says that's kinda scary. But she's with a bunch of nice people, so what's the problem? She's not even gonna have a criminal record because she just popped over here and has no history or social security number. Which you'd think they'd find out at some point. So Sunshine plans on singing them a folk tune to calm them down. Wait, is it realistic that he'd get to keep his guitar in a jail cell? I doubt that. Wouldn't cops refuse to let a person in jail keep their musical instrument because they would play it, and they could play it badly to annoy them? And some of the protesters are putting graffiti on the walls of the cell, which is ridiculously unbelievably stupid of them because they'd obviously get in even more trouble for that. Wouldn't they be supervised and stopped from doing that right away? Wouldn't a person not be allowed to have chalk and stuff in a jail cell either, for this very reason? Then in a shocking twist, he's an awful folk singer, so realistically, his parents were right. Maybe I was surprised because the protagonist is Sabrina, an idealistic, naive every girl. And her idealism was disproved. And one of the hippies says that it practically hurts her ears, which he thinks is cool. As the other girl says that you can feel the pain in his songs. Well, AC/DC's lead singer sounds kind of like Donald Duck when he sings, and that didn't stop him. But maybe he's so good at singing regardless of the voice. And it's not just the voice that's Sunshine's problem, it's his off-key singing. I like the flowers in her hair. Zelda thinks that they could get into the jail by getting themselves arrested, by staging a sit-in. So they sit there holding protest signs saying that the cops are unfair, so they're told that they can sit in here all they want. Is it really that easy for them to get arrested just by doing that? Freedom of assembly and freedom of speech is a myth? I guess so. Based on how small this panel is, you can only tell that it's inside the jail cell because of the graffiti on the wall from earlier in the 3 bars there. Zelda explains that she found Sabrina back in time by rewinding the magic mirror, and the cop doesn't react to this at all. I guess he did, but he's keeping quiet. And they all know that no one would believe him, so it's fine. And the guidance counselor calls them old ladies even though their hair isn't white and they aren't wrinkly. I guess in universe, they look old in the same way that the actresses for them in the sitcom look old. So not too old. Now Lacey calls them cool for being dressed like hippies, so he's not trying to be rude. But Hilda still whispers, "I've got half a mind to tell him he's going to go bald." That's the Hilda I know. I can't even imagine her voice actress saying that. I hope the animated series has the sitcom's voice actresses for the ants. I guess it didn't, since I know they fired Zelda's actress in the sitcom. Sunshine should have stopped singing after she clearly insulted a singing in front of him. They're all completely casual about trying to magically warp home in front of staring mortals. Maybe Hilda and Zelda know about the spy witch's erasing memories. It turns out the spell didn't work for some reason. Then Hilda says that her leg is twitching, and Zelda feels it too. She says that the spell is just taking longer because their powers are reduced. No one questions Salem talking, by the way, but I guess they don't bother because they figure that all they could say about is stating the obvious. And these guys are already making it obvious that they're witches. Anyways, won't Sabrina's aunts remember that spells took longer to work in the late 60s? And so they would tell Sabrina that instead of worrying? Why did they even choose to live in the mortal realm in the 60s anyways? You'd think after the 16 billionth time they had to cast a spell back then, they'd have it memorized for all time that casting took longer. They warp away, and then the guidance counselor says that it's time he gave up folk music because it's giving him delusions. If this comic wasn't forced to be kid-friendly when none of its main characters are kids anyways, it would have just manned up and had him say, "gave up getting high." Because he wouldn't say this. Also, obviously he wouldn't think it was a delusion because there were a ton of witnesses. That blonde lady clearly commented on it, and he replied to her. How do you think it was a delusion when multiple people had it? Does he think he's dreamed up this entire jail stay and all the people here? Because they know it was real eventually. Wouldn't the cops supervising the jail notice? And discuss it with them? Wouldn't witnessing this change history because these people would all be affected by seeing it? I guess the spy witches erased their memories of this. Because if they didn't do that ever, and just assumed it didn't matter because nobody would believe people about witchcraft anyways, well, that would add up because this kind of thing happens every day. And this is just a few witches, so eventually the amount of witch truthers would get big and discover each other. Especially when the internet gets popular. It would be the biggest conspiracy theory on Earth. They wouldn't want mortals to go back to knowing witches exist after a long time of believing them in the 16th century and turning on each other because of it. They warp home with Sabrina thinking that the 60s were cool. Apparently she either never took a history lesson or didn't pay any attention to one. The phone rings for Sabrina, and it's her guidance counselor letting her know that she left her history book in his office, so he wants her to pick it up tomorrow. That's considerate. I guess he dyed his hair black when he got older. She then unnecessarily ends the story by scaring him saying his old nickname, and she wanted to be allowed to tell him why she knew it, so that was stupidly reckless of her. But it is entertaining to see how much of a reckless person this version of Sabrina is. I never know what she's gonna do next sometimes. I'm glad this plot didn't completely rip off the premise of that episode of the sitcom where the present was made like the 60s, like I assumed. But that episode actually addressed how the 60s sucked, by referencing sexism, which was educational to the audience instead of letting kids think the 60s were cool. I think the fashion was nice looking, but that's the only charm I can think of it having. In the next story, Sabrina says happily that her Aunt Zelda hasn't changed her hair back to normal. I wonder if the comic will have the guts to keep this change. Well, I doubt it, because I don't remember her looking like this in the Sonic crossover. She wonders if she's ready for a new look, and Hilda just has to tell her that her hairstyle is dated and they were in the 60s. Amy Rose will probably never get that insult. But to be fair, her world's different from Earth, so maybe it's in fashion there. I mean, her hairstyle does look kind of ridiculous because it reminds me of Velma from Scooby-Doo. Hilda says that Zelda needs something more modern, and she's not worthy of suggesting and should see what Gustav says. I'm really glad the second story continues where the main story left off instead of being practically in a separate universe from it like usual. Gustav is, according to Hilda, the best looking hairstylist in the other realm. So Hilda thinks he should be in charge of giving Zelda a new look. I wonder if this will just bring her back to the way she just was for some reason. Hilda says that Gustav is very busy and might not be able to get her in before the turn of the century. I guess there's a lot of witches, but he does owe her a favor. She once talked Enchantress out of turning him into a chihuahua for making her perm too tight. Good thing she happened to be at Enchantress' expensive hairstylist at the moment. I wish I knew how she talked her out of it, because that seems out of character for her. She uses a spell to call him, and he teleports over to her while saying that of course he's very busy. I guess by call she actually meant send a telepathic message to him. Also, he's apparently on a first-name basis with her. He says that it could take days to even crack this hairspray shell. Hilda then says, "Remember, arf arf," instead of simply saying that she saved him from being turned into a chihuahua. And then Sabrina says that he was this close to being able to do commercials for Taco Bell. And God forbid she say the name of that place, because it wouldn't want free advertising. That makes sense. I heard those commercials were actually bad for Taco Bell. I mean, they were memorable, but not good for sales. I wish Hilda was just upfront with him right away. He puts a chisel against her hair, which is dumb. Then her new hairstyle is way too high and she falls over. What made him think that was a good idea after all of his experience? You'd think that since they're witches, if he thought this was a good idea, he would think that because there'd be a spell preventing this consequence. This really just happened for the humor value. I kinda liked her fire look, but not the wrinkles or whatever in her glasses. She says that she just wanted to get away from the green, and then he tantrums and warps away, saying that he can't do this anymore because the elemental look is in. I actually liked that this happened though, because it seemed way too convenient for them that the best hairstylist ever would go cater to Zelda, the main character. Salem says that he could help, and is asked how he knows anything about hairstyles. He says that he's seen a lot of talk shows and they feature makeover episodes. They do? I like they got to be useful in a way only he could be because he's stuck watching TV all the time. But wait, would Hilda and Zelda be too? They don't have jobs in this comic. Zelda agrees to let him help because she's got nothing to lose, and when he says he'll be back after grooming Zelda, Hilda snarks, "That paints an ugly picture," as she looks at the camera. Then we see her again, and it's actually weird and off-putting at this point to see her with blonde hair with a short hairstyle kind of similar to her old one. At that point, I'd rather have her have green hair. Of course, ideally, she should look like an animated version of her actress from the show. But that'd be nice to us show fans. Everyone likes the new look, as I'm still trying to get used to it. And surprisingly, the story is brave enough to end the story right there. Didn't she have green hair in the Sonic crossover? She definitely had this hairstyle. I just don't see what the point is of giving her a new look if it's not gonna correct the mistake and make her look like sitcom Zelda. The first story was by Bill Gallagher, and it was about Sabrina going back to the 60s to try to convince her guidance counselor to pursue his dream, just to eventually realize that he sucked at folk singing after all, and his parents were right. I always knew they were right, but I figured it was because the chances of any random Joe making it into the music business weren't very high. There would be stiff competition, and how many albums could he release before he'd run out of good music talent? He'd be better off getting an education job so he'd get to stay in it his whole life. And this plot could have easily been avoided if he had tried folk singing in front of Sabrina in the present. Anyways, Sabrina gets put in jail from a protest with him, because it's the 60s, and that's the only family-friendly thing the media can ever show about it. She even thinks the 60s were cool. Well, the show had my respect by teaching her otherwise. The whole story fell apart the minute Hilda and Zelda found out she was gone, and didn't just teleport her back to them immediately. If they can already use time travel spells, then why not? They use magic in front of mortals all the time without caring, so there's no excuse. Instead, they take the risk of going back in time, when, sure, they might be worried about someone witnessing them teleporting Sabrina away in the 60s, but there's also a chance that someone in the 60s might see them teleport themselves to the 60s. It's just as risky. So they find Salem at the clothing store after they miraculously went shopping instead of just focusing on finding their niece, and immediately using scrying and a crystal ball to find out where she is. And because of bullshit, their powers are weaker in the 60s, which is the whole excuse for why Sabrina needed her aunts and didn't just return home herself. It only happened to have the story last longer, and it was worth it, but come on, sunspots? They weakened the witches? We should have just been told that the Witches' Council did it in an attempt to make the witches abuse their magic less. So Sabrina goes home, hopefully learning a lesson that not everyone should pursue their dream career. Oh, who am I kidding? She probably only thinks it applies to him. If Sabrina was able to learn her lesson, then she wouldn't have used time travel again after the Cleopatra story. It was an interesting story, and I liked the fashion with the flowers. It just got forced at some point. And then the second story gives Zelda an off-putting makeover at the end. It's in the Uncanny Valley where it's too close to the older one, but not it. I don't know why they think this is the most competent hairstylist ever in the other realm. He just wasted everyone's time with unfunniness. That didn't need to be his own story then.